Take a breath. Let's talk about the respiratory membrane and what's happening at gas exchange. So we're down deep into the lungs at our alveoli. And we have about 150 million alveoli per lung that we're using this as surface area to breathe in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. What we're talking about is that point of gas exchange that we call the respiratory membrane. We'll look at this picture and then we'll look at a picture that pulls up once we're in the alveoli, what type of cells do we see to help this respiration occur. But first, let's talk about as we go deep into the lungs. So we look at the lungs and it's not a balloon as we describe it that we think it's blowing up that way because a balloon is hollow. When I'm breathing in, it's full of that bronchial tree that reaches the alveoli, those sacs that help contain and hold the gases and exchange them. But where is that occurring? So if we get deeper and deeper into our bronchial tree, in a previous video we talked about how we went from the trachea to the primary bronchi, which is roughly about 15 millimeters, and then slowly gets smaller and smaller to where like a half millimeter, and getting to the point where we have terminal bronchioles and our respiratory bronchioles to the point of gas exchange in our alveoli. And keep in mind, these alveoli are surrounded with capillaries. So we're looking at that process. If I take one piece of this and I go microscopically, we're describing what's happening at that gas exchange. Because as I breathe in, I'm pushing in that oxygen to go into the bloodstream. So as we're describing this, we're looking at that point of gas exchange here. That's essentially 3 layers. So the first part of it, as I breathe in and breathe in that oxygen, it's first hitting the alveoli. And we call that the alveolar epithelium. We call that epithelium because it's epithelial tissue, specifically simple squamous epithelium. Remember, simple means it's one layer cell. Squamous is scale-like, flat and thin, which is helpful for moving something like gases across the surface. Remember, some points we see stratified epithelial tissue, and that's more likely for protection. So simple, one layer, squamous, thin, and flat, to move that through. So essentially, our alveoli are lined with simple squamous epithelium. So we call that alveolar epithelium. Very straightforward. And then on the other side where we have the capillary is called capillary endothelium, but that endothelial layer is again simple squamous epithelium. So the body repeats itself to make this simple, to be able to move those gases. And so as I describe this, I'm looking at the blood vessels here. When you start to learn arteries and veins, the larger branches in our body, as we learn these vessels, they're typically 3 layers. And we see 3 layers throughout the body. As they get smaller and smaller and smaller, they become capillaries. And capillaries are only one layer of tissue, and it often helps for the movement of something. So we go back just like simple epithelial tissue. Capillaries are one layer surrounding the vessel, and we call that the capillary endothelium. So that simple squamous epithelium is the tissue that makes up the capillary, simple squamous epithelium that makes up the alveolus, or alveoli for plural. In between them is a connective tissue holder, so that fused basal laminae or basement membrane in between, that is that junction between the 2 layers. So when we talk about the point of gas exchange, structurally what's occurring is at that respiratory membrane, you have the simple squamous epithelium on both sides of the alveolus and then of the capillary. And holding it together is that small band of connective tissue, the basal laminae. So we look at this for a respiration, but then we start to see, once we look inside the cells, we can see that the majority of it is to help the respiration, but there's other cells present as well. So I'm describing again as we go all the way deep down microscopically into our alveolus or alveoli, and I bring this up here to look at one alveolus. And remember, they're surrounded by the capillaries because that's the point of gas exchange that we call the respiratory membrane. For this to occur, we're relying on what we call pneumocytes, which are the same thing as saying our respiratory cells here. The first type of cells that make up the majority, it's roughly about 97% of all the cells in the alveoli, are called type 1 alveolar cells or respiratory cells or pneumocytes. And so all of the cells that you see through here that make up the alveolus. These are my type 1 alveolar cells. Remember that type of tissue, simple squamous epithelium, thin and flat. So the majority of this are respiratory cells. That's for the actual surface area to be able to move the gases back and forth through the blood side, through my capillaries. And that's where we go back to the respiratory membrane. The other cells we see here are type 2 alveolar cells that we call surfactant cells. Surfactant cells are made up of lipids and proteins. And lipids, remember, are fats. And fats don't mix well with water. The goal of these cells is to produce a surface tension. And what that is doing is making sure the water interaction molecules don't disrupt the way the actual alveoli are holding its shape. So bottom line, surfactant cells help to maintain a nice holding shape for gases to come in and out. I want to be efficient as possible, so I want these to be open. To me, surfactant cells are very similar to when you wax your car. When you wax your car and you see that first rain come and the water beads on top of the hood because it can't attract to the other sides of the water dropping down, you've reduced that surface tension to where it can't grab on. It's the same thing as surfactant cells. We rely on water for respiration, but we also want to maintain the structural integrity of the alveoli itself. So surfactant cells are providing that surface tension or reducing that surface tension so I can breathe. And then lastly, macrophages, with our immune cells, the ability to engulf. Remember, phagocytosis is the ability to engulf and eat something. We have macrophages primarily for that dust as things get down deep into our lungs to engulf things that don't belong into the lungs that can harm the actual process of respiration. So as we get deep into the lungs, our primary tissue is our simple squamous epithelium, and that's our alveolar pneumocytes or respiratory cells, roughly 97% of all the cells. But then we add to it that we have our surfactant cells, type 2, and our macrophages to support that process. So as we look at the respiratory membrane and get down deep into the lungs, it helps us to understand the process and how efficient this is because we have cells that assist this. These are the respiratory cells of the alveoli.